start. That sounds about good. So welcome everybody to this session. I'm going to share my screen so that we can actually start working on the R3.0 working session here. Shifting pace, we called it, from sustainability to regeneration and thriving. I will present that together with my senior director colleague, Bill Bowie. And we really want to, as I said in the overview, describe what we are doing, first of all, to define regeneration properly, but then also what sort of platforms have we conceived of to make our contribution to a regenerative and distributive economy. So with that, and no further ado, not wasting time, let's move into the topic. And Bill, over to you.
Great, thanks, Ralph. So we wanted to start and really do kind of the first half of this session, really looking at, how do we define regeneration? How do we define sustainability? How do we define thrivability? So the way that we've had most success on this is with this graphic, which we call our maturation matrix. It was an outgrowth of an earlier, what we called strategy continuum. And what it does is it maps out these different modalities, you might say, on the top of the matrix, on the top continuum. So essentially, we see there being a continuum between practices or organizations or outcomes, and most importantly, that are unsustainable on the left-hand side and sustainable on the right-hand side. So they can be unsustainable and actually degenerative, or they can be improving incrementally, but still be unsustainable. So that's why we have incremental on the top. We believe that our systems, generally speaking right now, in particular our global economic system, is in the degenerative to improving zone. And we therefore believe that there needs to be transformation to achieve sustainability. So the middle line is really just the line between unsustainable and sustainable. Once you cross that line, you can enter the realm of regeneration and what we call thrivability. The important point here is that while there is overlap between the terms sustainability and regeneration, they aren't exactly the same thing, and we believe that you need to assess both sustainability and regeneration. So that's in some ways the most important point that we're making here. On the other axis, we've just mapped it to the different scales and the way that these scales need to link between one another, from the nano individual to the micro company, to the meso level of portfolios and investments, industry sectors for companies, or habitats in a geopolitical sense, all the way up to the macro systems level. And then even we talk about the supra level, we've added that more recently, of the existential level. And you'll note that we have multi-level selection noted in there. That's a nod to pro-social and the evolutionary biology work of David Sloan Wilson that's integrated into pro-social. That basically that the selection, the evolutionary selection process needs to happen at multiple levels or multiple scales, interconnect in an interconnected way. So Ralph, if you can take it to the next slide, we just mapped in here some of the modalities and where we think they would fit into this. So for example, on the micro level of a company, and Joshua, I think you mentioned this, we see CSR or ESG or impact investing as moving in the right direction. So it's improving, but it actually doesn't have in general a mechanism for really assessing sustainability in a disciplined way. And so we would put it there, and glad to see you clapping on that. Other things might be, profit maximization in the degenerative space, shareholder primacy, or what we call monocapitalism in the degenerative side, whereas we believe that multi-capitalism or regenerative capitalism would be on the right-hand side, or thrivability and even post-capitalism might be on the right-hand side. So this is just meant to be provocative. We're not nailing all of these down, but we can move on to the next slide to just explore. Why do we put the line right down the middle? So this is drawing from the work of one of our very close colleagues, Mark McElroy, in his dissertation from 2008 at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And he noted that there are several ways to define unsustainable versus sustainable. One is an absolute orientation on either end. The next orientation would be a relative orientation, so less sustainable or more sustainable. And then finally, there is a binary orientation, where there's actually a line in the middle where actually something can be defined as either unsustainable or sustainable. And what Mark had to say about this was that the binary conception of sustainability is, in a sense, a variant of the absolute goal orientation, in the sense that it is completely anti-relativistic. So that's in some ways a provocative statement, because as we've said already in this conference, that things are relative. There is relativity. So we're not trying to negate Einstein here, but what we're saying is the more sustainable or less sustainable is actually not giving us the information that we need. So one can be in a state of becoming more sustainable forever, and yet not actually become sustainable. So actually you can't do it forever, because you can, if you're only moving towards sustainability but not achieving it, then the next slide is what comes into play, which is tipping points. So tipping points are where a system will tip from one state of being into another state of being, and that's an irreversible and nonlinear transition. And so that's in particular the reason why we take this anti-relativistic perspective, because there are tipping points in the real world, and those we want to avoid those in systems that we believe are operating in ways that we wish, such as our climate system as it functions in the Holocene. We would like to maintain conditions like they have been throughout the Holocene, even though we are now in the Anthropocene, where that is at question. Social systems can also tip from desirable into undesirable states, or interestingly, social systems can tip from undesirable into desirable spaces. So that's another reason for monitoring these thresholds, is to see if we can get through to a positive threshold or tipping point. Next slide, please, Ralph. So just a little bit of background on why this binary. Really, we go back to the 1972 limits to growth from Donella Meadows and her colleagues, where they defined carrying capacities, and they noted or they coined the term overshoot and collapse. So if we're working within a carrying capacity, then the population, as you see, would rise until it reaches its carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is the resources that population can rely on over time. And this first graph is an example of working within that and not overshooting. The next graphic is where a population exceeds its carrying capacity, and as you can see, it collapses. So it goes into a nosedive, if you will. And that happens with populations of all sorts, not just living populations, but other systemic dynamics. So this is just an introduction to the idea of exceeding carrying capacity. This is also addressed in the book by Bill Catton, Overshoot, where he defines carrying capacity as the maximum permanently supportable load. And he defines overshoot as going beyond the carrying capacity, which results in crash or die off, or in Donella Meadows' terms, collapse. So that's the reason why these carrying capacity thresholds are particularly important to respect. Next slide. Great. So I'm sure that many of you are familiar with these graphics, but just in case not, the planetary boundaries concept was introduced in 2009 by the Stockholm Resilience Center, and it was looking at ecological thresholds, and it found 9 thresholds in particular that are part of the Earth system. And the research showed that we are overshooting. Originally, the research in 2009 was 3 of those boundaries. In the refresh in 2015, it found that we are actually overshooting on 4 of these planetary boundaries. And so, as you know, when you're in overshoot, you're essentially in a realm of imminent collapse. Next slide introduces the notion of shortfalling or undershooting, if you will, the social foundations. So Kate Rayworth in her donut introduced the inner ring of the donut in addition to that outer ring that she drew from the planetary boundaries. So she basically added social thresholds or social foundations to the mix. And this 2017 graphic from a Lancet journal article that she wrote shows that humanity writ large is shortfalling on all 12 of these social foundations. So we are in a perilous situation here. Next slide brings us back to overshoot, where we just have a variant of that graphic that we had at the beginning from limits to growth, where we have not just the carrying capacity and the load, but also what is called temporary carrying capacity, or what Catton in the book calls phantom carrying capacity. So in other words, that's when a load has exceeded the carrying capacity, but the collapse doesn't necessarily happen immediately. That's why it's called phantom carrying capacity. So we're operating on carrying capacity that doesn't actually exist. It is going to collapse, if you will. So that's why it is very important to address these carrying capacities in both ecological and social systems. Next slide. Here, and I see that there's a chat function here. Can we give an example of that? Well, here we go. Our timing is right. Here is a graphic that I'm imagining that everybody is familiar with. This is Drew Harris tweeted this out in early 2020 of the flatten the curve, or the COVID curves graphic. And this graphic had been around for years and years from the US Centers for Disease Control. And he had used them many times in educating healthcare professionals. And he found that, generally speaking, they didn't understand until he started adding this dotted line of what is the healthcare system capacity. That's what really matters, is what's the carrying capacity of our healthcare system. Our healthcare system is a combination of built capitals, so the hospitals themselves, the beds, the ventilators, social capital in the terms of the network knowledge of, say, an ER room staff, emergency room staff, and then the human capital of the knowledge of individual nurses, doctors, ER room folks. And what this is pointing out is that without protective measures, COVID, the curve, or the growth of COVID exceeds the healthcare system capacity, and therefore we're in a position of collapse, if you will, or an unsustainable situation, whereas with protective measures, we can stay within the healthcare system capacity. So I hope that that's a helpful explanation. In terms of measuring this, how do you measure and manage carrying capacities? Well, that's where we come back to the work of Mark McElroy with the sustainability quotient that he introduced in 2008, where S equals A over N. S is sustainability, equals A is the actual impacts of the carrying capacities of vital capital resources over the normative impacts. So the norm is what those impacts would need to be in order to be sustainable. And so one of our other colleagues, Alan White, coined the notion of numeration over denomination. And he's said that essentially, when it comes to measuring sustainability in the last 20 or more years, we've been in the realm of numeration. We've only been looking at actual impacts. We haven't actually been in the realm of denomination, where we are contextualizing those impacts against the sustainability norm, if you will. So in essence, we're still on the left-hand side of the maturation matrix. So again, let's use a more hands-on example of that with carbon. A carbon footprint is just the actual impact. It's the actual amount of carbon that has been emitted. That's the numerator. We would need to add to that the denominator of the carbon budget. So Donella Meadows, one of the main authors of the Limits to Growth report, later in 1998, in a report she wrote, she said that basically this numerator information means nothing to people. So, you know, you can tell somebody the carbon footprint, but is that good? Is it bad? It really only makes sense. It starts to tell a message, as Dana said, when we add the denominator of the context of the carbon budget. How much budget do we have left? So that's a hands-on example. Next slide. This is where we will just, in the next 2 slides, just talk about the shift from sustainability to regeneration. And we'll do that with natural capital first, or ecological resources, with Daly's rules. This is Herman Daly, who was a World Bank economist in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, and he created 3 rules. One is that renewable resources, so fish, forests, soils, groundwaters, they must be used no faster than the rate at which they regenerate. This is just a core concept of regeneration. However, we don't only use regenerative or renewable resources. We also rely on non-renewable resources. And this is something that I think the regenerative community and regenerative platforms would really need to look at closely, is that if it's relying on a non-renewable resource like mineral oils or fossil fuels or what have you, that they must be used no faster than renewable substitutes for them can be put into place. So he's basically saying that we need to move to a fully renewable or regenerative system. And then his last is essentially a variant that, you know, processes can create pollution and waste. And that isn't necessarily a problem that happens in living systems. We create waste, as all of us know very well. The question is, can that waste be absorbed, recycled into systems, and thereby rendered harmless? So it's the rate at which the assimilation happens that is the key. So that's on natural capital. When it comes to what are called anthropogenic capital. So again, I mentioned human capital, social capital, etc. The best way that we often use to show this is with the human capital of knowledge. So knowledge actually goes through a life cycle. And so again, this is working with Mark McElroy. So knowledge, if there's a knowledge claim, if there's a piece of knowledge that people are relying on, what we must do is continually test that knowledge to see if it's valid. And knowledge that has been validated, that it works in the world, it's giving us the results that we want. And when we challenge it intellectually, it stands that test. If knowledge doesn't stand that test, then we let go of that knowledge and we bring in new knowledge. So there's a constant cycle, if you will, or regeneration of knowledge. In the next part of this, this is relying on basically double loop learning. So as you see in the left-hand side, the knowledge life cycle is a form of double loop learning. That's a concept that was introduced by Argyris and Schoen in the 1970s. So the right-hand side is just a very generic sense of double loop learning. And again, because this is cyclical, it means that we can continually regenerate. So whereas regenerating natural resources really requires the worlds, the earth, nature to do the work, regenerating human resources, humans can continually do that. And in fact, if the next part of this is looking at triple loop learning, which adds the element of, as you can see at the top, how do we establish rightness? So if single loop learning is, are we doing things right? And double loop learning is, are we doing the right things? There's still one more, are we defining rightness in the right way, so to speak? And that's drawing on the work of Gregory Bateson and others. So we just wanted to give you, and again, that's conceptual, but that's the foundations of some of our thinking around this combination of sustainability and regeneration. So that brings us through the first part of what I had mentioned, and handing it off to Ralph really to take us into a closer look at R3.0 and how we have developed a multi-platform network for regeneration. So over to you, Ralph.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And I think what really became clear is that notion of understanding sustainability always in context. So Bill was mentioning the sustainability quotient, and that really is something that really goes through everything that we do. It is really very important for us. The question now is, how do we get to regeneration, and how do we design sort of the necessary work ecosystem? Now that is really the work of R3.0 in a nutshell in this one slide here. We have started this journey, our own journey, in 2013, and from 2015 onwards, we used backcasting, or even earlier, we used backcasting as an idea where we looked from a desired ideal backwards to where we are right now, and then developing recommendations to get to a regenerative and distributive economy. And then we were looking at those areas or fields that actually need to transform, and not just one by one, but simultaneously. And that got us to the idea of our so-called work ecosystem. We developed a first set of so-called blueprints, and blueprints are sort of like one-year projects with a global working group through a due process up until we released the blueprints. And the first one was really on reporting. That was where we also started off from. How would reporting look if it truly served the idea of a regenerative and distributive economy? But very quickly saw that there are more things necessary, more areas that needed to be tackled. So the second one that we looked at was accounting. So how would accounting need to change? And based on that, how would data architectures need to be developed, or data needs to be structured in order to support accounting that again supports reporting for a regenerative and distributive economy. And all of that culminates really in the idea, how would, if it was available, how would that change business models? So our first or fourth blueprint that we wrote was around new business models. And with all of those 4 blueprints, which are sort of the 4 basic pillars of our work ecosystem, we got a question: how is that then implemented within organizations at all sizes and all sorts? And we said, yeah, that's a fair question. And we came up with a 5th blueprint, which we call a transformation journey, because we really realized that what we're talking about right now is transformative. It needs organizations to be willing to do that, and by that also be willing to transform their organizations. And after we have done sort of this first part of the work ecosystem, we realized that there are areas that we need to go a little bit more into depth, because we were seeing them used and abused outside of our thinking. So the first one that we looked at was sustainable finance. From the perspective of the earlier blueprints, do we think that sustainable finance, as it is articulated, actually does exist? The question around what sort of value is needed and what to do with the idea of a circular economy as a designed or defined end goal of where we need to go to. I'm living in the Netherlands, where the government has actually decided they want to be the first full circular economy by 2050. And I have huge problems with that. And that is why we try to combine the idea of what is of value and what sort of economic design is actually needed into a blueprint that we call value cycles. So those two, the sustainable finance and the value cycles blueprint, we will look a little bit more in depth in the next couple of slides. And then there are actually 2 more blueprints that we're working on right now. One is already in the middle of the development. We call it educational transformation. Really looking at a complete overhaul of the idea of how education needs to work. And then finally, we need to also look at systemic, we need funding governance for systemic transformation as well. And then you also see a first example of a white paper, one that was authored by Bill, called From Monocapitalism to Multi-Capitalism. So aside of all of the blueprints, we now also have white papers and opinion papers and case studies. Those really help to further flesh out that family of blueprints, our work ecosystem, and are also steps towards a second generation of blueprints that we will work on from 2022 onwards, roundabout 2022 onwards. So that gives you an idea of sort of the core product of R3.0. Let me very quickly go into 2 of the blueprints that we have developed. The last 2 that we actually released last year at our 2020 conference. The first one was really around sustainable finance. And, you know, as you heard Bill talking about the carrying capacities and the need for thresholds and allocations, and the need for sort of an absolute figure to compare it to the science-based and ethical norms, and then looking at the whole spectrum of financial products, we doubted that sustainable finance actually did exist already. Very often used as term, but we've also seen that in all of the ratings, rankings, and indices that are only capable to define who is best in class of those that describe that they became less bad in what they did. We also looked at UNPRI and UNEP FI. We looked at the new EU taxonomy. We looked at country examples. And we actually said, we're sorry to say, but sustainable finance, understanding sustainability as defined and as Bill explained, so far doesn't exist yet. That's quite a bummer for a lot of people in the finance industry, of course. And then the question is, well, if that's what we call into question, how are we then going to help solve that problem? And what you see here is an overview of how we have structured the blueprint. First of all, I want to draw your attention to these 3 different kinds of factors. We call them enabling factors, activation factors, and transformation factors. So if we say that sustainable finance doesn't exist yet, we need to define, or we need to enable a process where players from the financial markets would actually step into a discussion that is not dualistic, but solution-oriented on what are we then talking about when we talk about sustainable finance. And here are sort of like in 4 bubbles, the sort of principles that can be used for enabling such a process. One of them you already heard about, the 8 core design principles for governing a commons, as presented by Pro-Social. We at R3.0, we have our own 9 disclosure principles for regenerative and distributed economy. We also worked quite closely with Capital Institute and John Fullerton, who had or came up with 8 principles for a regenerative economy. And then another one of our advocation partners, Marcy Murninghan, works on elements for civic fiduciary or equity culture, as she calls it. So these are all tools, so to say, that can be used in designing a dialogue with financial market players to enable the discussion of what is actually necessary to come up with sustainable finance. Then in the middle piece, you see the so-called activation factors. This is really, those are in total, you will see around 10 areas where we need to see a drastic shift. We have clustered them into 4 groups. The first one is really about scope. What is the scope of sustainable finance? What needs to be done in areas like policies and governance, then in areas like engagement with the different players in the financial market field, and what sort of practice and performance measurement is then actually necessary. And one of our partners in the working group for sustainable finance really also said, well, that's all great, but in the end, are you actually transforming the financial system by that? So that brought us to the point where we say, well, we also need to talk about transformation factors. So we added those into the structure of this blueprint. So this is sort of what the blueprint offers in total. And when we then look into those different factors and into the activation factors, there are areas that we define and that are then also explained in the blueprint. So that move from ESG investing to threshold investing, that is already clear from what Bill has explained to you. From mono-capitalism to multi-capitalism is an important piece. And then from impact valuation to system valuation. So a clearer understanding of what the system value is that financial market actors and transactions really deliver. There's also the link here to the value cycles blueprint, actually. I personally see them as twins to each other, but that is really sort of a 3-dimensional area to scope out what sustainable finance in essence needs to cover. And then on the more process-oriented side, when we look at policies and governance, we need a shift from fiduciary duty to what we call strategic duty. We need a shift from alpha generation to better activism. And we need to move away from dirty lobbying to positive politicking. So those are all areas that are described and laid out in the blueprint. On the engagement side, we need to move away from tea and biscuit engagement, as it was so nicely called, to what is called forceful stewardship. And one of our advocation partners, Preventable Surprises, works a lot in that area. And we need to move from competitive to collaborative advantage to collaborative advocation for what's actually needed in sustainable finance. And then on the practice and performance side, we need to move from scenario planning to transformation planning. Scenario planning is nice, but that doesn't lead to transformation, as we've seen in the case of Shell just in the last couple of weeks. And from inside out enterprise and portfolio risk to outside in systemic and existential risk. So all of these are areas where we need shifts in order to enable and then to activate sustainable finance to actually come into existence. And still, there's more needed. Those transformation factors that our colleague has also pointed us towards and that we then added into the blueprint is that there's more understanding needed, that we need to see economies as ecosystems. We need to look at it from a holistic perspective and really bring in that notion of regeneration and not just sustainability. We call that the foundational transformation factors. And then on the functional side, that idea of accepting post-growth, mutualism, and multi-scale bioregional aspects as well. So what you see here is that full spectrum of what a blueprint of R3.0 covers, and it then ends with a whole set of recommendations for all the different players. I already said the value cycles blueprint is a little bit a twin to that, also written at the same time, really trying to combine two major questions. One question is, what is then of value in a regenerative and distributive economy? And then also, what sort of economic system design is actually needed to capture and allow systemic value to actually take place? So we looked very, very carefully and very in depth into all sorts of value definitions, from intrinsic value to shareholder value to shared value creation to valuation to impact valuation, to actually come out at what we call system valuation or system value. Because we don't think that impact valuation goes far enough. It just needs that link to thresholds and allocations and to multi-capitalism to be context-based and multi-capital-based in order to allow a statement about system value creation. But then on the economic system design, we were looking at all of the sort of archetypes of economic system design. We looked at linear value chains. That's the old Porter concept, and that has found its update in circular economy designs roundabout for the last decade, where you normally have the sort of technological and the biological cycle in order to recycle and to bring resources back into a cycle. We also looked at that with quite some depth and also critiqued it, just simply from the perspective that we also think that there is a need for at least another cycle, which is the human cycle. So partners of ours have been working on that, because all of this doesn't make sense if human beings don't want all of that. So from that perspective, there is definitely a place for the circular economy, but it's not the end goal. So from that perspective, that needs to be embraced, but also embedded into a bigger context that Bill is going to talk about a little bit more.
Great, thank you, Ralph. So really moving from linear to circular, what we realized is that really the world works more in cyclical flows. So on the left, some of you may recognize this is the Halling cycle or the adaptive cycle, which is a description of how development typically happens the term exploitation to conservation to release and reorganization. The term exploitation, I actually think is provocative. I'm not a huge fan of using that to describe the term, but that's what Halling uses to note that that's how development happens in ecological systems as well as in social systems. And he also notes that this happens not just at one level, that it can happen at, again, drawing back to the notions of pro-social, that it can happen at multiple levels. So in other words, one of the things he says is that points to a panarchy, what he calls a panarchy. A panarchy is a representation of a hierarchy as a nested set of adaptive cycles. The functioning of those cycles and the communication between them determines the sustainability of a system. So that's the next two graphics actually represent how these adaptive cycles operate at multiple levels. So you can see that both space and time of adaptation can happen. I'm not going to go into too much depth on that because that could take up an entire session. But I think that the point that we're primarily trying to make here is that cyclical development is much more how the world works than either linear or even circular.
Bill,
yes.
Sorry, I just gave up until the top of the hour, so you still have 24 minutes for your session.
That's great. Thanks so much, Alistair.
Okay.
Great. So next slide here. So we mentioned John Fullerton. We work closely with John and picking up on this notion of the fractal nature He says that regenerative economies are built on nested fractal relationships across many levels. So, individual human beings, families, communities, regions, countries, even global civilization, and the biosphere as a whole. So while each subcomponent can be seen as a whole, they can never be viewed as separate. And Fullerton is one of the few folks that we see who's really got broad attention that is speaking in these terms about economies and the need for economies to shift to regenerative ways of being. So he basically set forth 8 principles of a regenerative economy in his 2015 Regenerative Capitalism paper. And so these are some of the elements. The one that I like the most is edge effect abundance. So it basically says that in natural systems, so regenerative economics basically look to living systems principles. So these principles of a regenerative economy are based on living systems principles. So he points out that in a coastal estuary where water from the rivers on land are meeting the waters from the ocean or a sea, that it's really in this intersection at the edge between these two systems where much of the innovation takes place, so to speak. And he believes that same kind of innovation happens at the margins of systems. So one of the things we like to say at R3.0 is that we operate at the margins of some of the larger or more mainstream, if you will, communities, and we do that on purpose in the sense that we believe that there's much more innovation there. So next slide, please, Ralph. So finally, in that particular blueprint, we believe we end up with the notion of system value cycles. So we believe that value needs to be systemic. So this is drawing on the work of some of our peers at the Future Fit Foundation, who point out that shareholder value essentially sees business as separate from the environment and society in prioritizing financial returns. Shared value, which is another concept from Michael Porter, in addition to the value chain. Shared value essentially says, well, business can operate in ways that harmonize with society and the environment. But as you can see, it's not a full harmonization. There's still ways in which business operates that in ways that are disharmonious with the environment and with society. So it's not a fully positive pursuit, if you will, or to use the Future Fit language. System value, however, recognizes that business or the creation of value by business happens within society. And there are ways in which value is created in society that it transcends value that's created in business. It transcends financial value, if you will. And furthermore, all of those are nested within the environment. And the environment is creating value that transcends even business and society. So really, the creation of value must attend to creating value in ways that are in the commercial sphere that are also creating value. So in other words, they're not destroying value in society and the environment as a means of creating value just within the nested system of business. So we are big adherents to the notion of system value, and it's actually an idea that is still really in its nascent stages of being developed, and we're in conversation with partners about continuing to develop the concept of system value. So this brings us to our second example of a platform, if you will. So if the first example of a platform of R3.0 is our blueprint system, so the platform of knowledge that we are co-creating with our working groups to create a platform of knowledge. The second platform would be around thresholds and allocations. And we jokingly use this graphic. Ella, I hope that this one does a little bit better in terms of communication with design, where the donut is obviously Kate Raworth's donut, representing the notion of thresholds. So the inner edge of that donut being the social foundations or social thresholds that we need to not go below. Like we shouldn't go below a living wage, for example. And the outer edge is the ecological ceilings or the planetary boundaries. So for example, the 1.5 degree climate boundary or threshold, we should not go above those, but we should operate in the sweet space, the safe and just operating space of the donut. So that's the notion of thresholds. Allocations is the pie. You know, if all of our resources are a global pie, then what's the slice of the pie that you know, each person or each company should get? That's the notion of allocation. And we like to say that allocation is always happening. So there's always allocation of resources. And the question really is it being done on a conscious and fair basis or not? We believe it's a myth that the market allocates resources in a rational way. The market actually, the way that it's designed, we can demonstrate empirically that it actually does not allocate resources in ways that are fair, just, or proportionate. All we need to do is look at the value of Jeff Bezos at 100 something billion dollars to demonstrate that that is not the kind of allocation that we need. So how do we do this in practice? And so this comes back to Ella's question earlier about from the sidebar about indicators. So we at R3.0 are collaborating with the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development on this Thresholds of Transformation pilot project. And that is, we co-developed with UNRISD a set of indicators that were focused on these 3 tiers. So the first tier is incrementalist numeration, and that notion of numeration goes back to the sustainability quotient. So that comprises numerator indicators that are focused on actual impacts. So those would basically be able to tell you, are we moving in the right direction? But they're not normative, so they don't have that denominator in place. Tier 2 is around contextualized denomination. So it contextualizes that impact or the numerator within the norm or what that impact would need to be in order to be sustainable. So these are also called context-based indicators after the notion of sustainability context, which is an important principle in our field that Ralph and I are very ardent supporters of that concept, because they take the context of sustainability thresholds into account. The third tier is around activating transformation. So it essentially says that if we can agree that the existing system and the existing way of operating is actually not sustainable or regenerative, then what kinds of transformations do we need to apply? So we are actively piloting these indicators with about 24 companies right now. Ralph, did you want to add anything about the project that we're doing with UNRISD before we move on to the next example?
Yeah, I think I want to mention 2 points. One is that there is a growing awareness even within the UN system that the whole sort of like plethora of different schemes and methodologies in the UN system, this distracts us from measuring sustainability. There's also the link to the UN statistics and then to the national statistics offices, which I think is important to make, because, and I was describing that we also have a data blueprint, so there needs to be sort of a fluid exchange of data from the organization level to the meso level up to the macro level. And this sort of nomenclatura, or the sort of 3 tiers, actually allows for a fresh approach to get us to that. And I think the other point which I want to mention here is that this, of course, has been done because all of the standard setters in the field who should have done that homework haven't done it. Bill mentioned the sustainability context principle, which I was an instigator of at GRI when I worked at GRI, together with Alan White, who's really sort of the godfather of sustainability context. And we've been huge advocates for that, but this principle simmers since 2002 and was never really enforced. And what you now see is that the majority, or even 99.7% of all sustainability reports are just ESG progress reports, just because of the lack of enforcing and enhancing knowledge around sustainability context. And this project, from my perspective, is really a huge breakthrough in that area and could lead to drastic change, both on the UN, but also in the standard setters world, which of course would affect all organizations that report, to really take those 3 tiers into account.
Great, thank you, Ralph. So the second example in this of how we are building out this as a particular platform, if you will, is by incubating a global thresholds and allocations council. So essentially, Ralph mentioned the sustainability context principle that he helped develop at the Global Reporting Initiative. That was done with Alan White, who is a co-founder of the Global Reporting Initiative and a very close colleague of ours that you can see here. And he says that sustainability requires contextualization within thresholds. That's what sustainability is all about. And yet humanity lacks a global governance body or system to manage ourselves within these thresholds. So as Ted pointed out, that really when we're collectives of people, we need governance mechanisms to engage with each other in successful ways. So we believe that the lack of a body that is looking at thresholds and allocations globally and obviously at lower levels of geography is absolutely necessary. So we have been incubating this concept for several years and will continue to do so. At the same time, in the next slide, we are pivoting to actually get that work going in the near term by creating a global thresholds and allocations network. So these are just a few logos of organizations that are in one way or another engaging with thresholds and many of them also the allocations of those thresholds. So Carbon Tracker is one that's fairly well known. They identified the notion of the carbon bubble. And so essentially you know, we as humanity are overusing our carbon budget, and that is leading to a bubble in the economy that will burst eventually when it crosses the carrying capacity. Donut Economics Action Lab, Kate Rayworth created this a year or so ago to implement the donut economics. I mentioned Future Fit in terms of their definition of system value. They've created a mechanism. So they have an alternative set of indicators. So Ella, to your question, Future Fit is an alternative and complementary set of indicators to be applied to businesses. The multi-capital scorecard is one of our colleagues, Mark McElroy, has created that to basically apply thresholds and allocations across all of the capitals, natural capital, social capital, etc. The UN guiding principles on human rights in the far left is an example of a social threshold. So that's basically a norm that needs to be applied to human rights by businesses in particular. So these are just a few examples of organizations, and our plan is to create a network amongst these organizations that essentially creates a kind of platform so that all of these aren't individually addressing the notion of thresholds and allocations, but they we're doing it all together. And Michaela, actually, B Corp is not on this list, but they could be. B Corp actually has several elements of its B impact assessment that call for context. So we know of organizations and work closely, for example, with Cabot Creamery Cooperative, which is a B Corp. The reason that we would hold off on doing that is that many of the indicators that B Corp calls for and is quantified don't require context. So it's an area where there's certainly overlap, and we do engage with B Corp on a regular basis. So that this is just a partial list. This isn't intended to be a comprehensive list. So if something is missing, it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't belong there. So that's the platform, the second platform around thresholds and allocations, and over to you, Ralph, for our third platform.
Yeah, and I want to present two more platform ideas that we have built within R3.0, really very much around community awareness building and then also collaboration. First one is our Advocation partner and academic alliance partner network. You see a lot of organizations already on that list. I think in total we have around about 110 partners there. They come from all different backgrounds, often consultancies, very often liking our sort of design and our structure, because it offers them to position themselves in there. And also lots of them joining because they say, how can I avoid to be part of the problem and become more part of the solution? And that is really what many of these organizations do. They collaborate with us in different levels of depth and breadth. We're not advocating for something specific. It is something where they pick up our collective know-how and see how they can embed that into their own value propositions, and really by that creating sort of a snowball effect where they bring that to their clients and to their networks and advocate for those necessary changes. And our Academic Alliance network, which is smaller, you see them here on the right side of the slide. That's really universities, business schools, centers, institutes that came to us mainly. We weren't advocating for that. They really came to us by saying, what you do is interesting from a curriculum building. And we're actually working, for example, with Audencia quite closely in curriculum building for their Chief Value Officer MBA. We will do one of our transformation journey programs together with them next year. That's baked into that MBA actually. And another area is case study writing, and then something that we haven't achieved yet, but that's possible is really joint research on topics that those partners deem to be very necessary. Just yesterday we were in a conference, in an academic conference around new business models, and we're actually recommending a couple of research topics to be strongly embraced in order to make a contribution or clearer contribution to what is a new business model and when can you actually talk about a new business model to be a sustainable business model. So here's a lot of potential that's possible. So that's a platform within the R3.0 world or environment that is becoming bigger and bigger. You're all invited to think about the possibility there if you want to join there. And then another sort of last platform that we want to mention is our conferences. We do them since 2013. We don't have a written or a website for the 2013 conference, but since 2014 we have a good documentation of our conferences. And as you see, we already had 6 + 1, so 7 conferences. And our next one will actually be this year on the 7th and 8th of September. Again, to be a fully online conference, about a little bit less than 3 months away from us. And we call it Thresholds of Transformation, really looking also into the outcome of the UNRIS project and piloting regenerative and distributive economies and cultures. So we've actually stayed virtual just simply because of the COVID situation, quite unstable. And just today, the World Health Organization is warning us for a dire fall. So from that perspective, sort of Delta variant of the COVID virus seems to take a lot of rise at this moment again. So I think we're on the safe side offering this as an online conference once again. And what this picture shows you really on the right side is that as an outcome of everything that we're doing, we're structuring our conferences for a couple of years at least in a sort of same structure. So we will talk about science and behavior, finance and growth, value and circularity, and education and governance. To a certain degree, you see a reflection of many of our blueprint projects in there. But also, I think it is fair to say that whenever we look at any sort of problem systemically, and just take climate change as an example, we've not been able to solve climate change for 40 years now, although we have lots and most of the information we needed. We just didn't do it. And I think part of the reason why that is that we don't look at these problems from all of these different perspectives. It's mainly a dualistic discussion in climate change between science and politics. So that's more or less what I wanted to capture here. Thanks an awful lot. If you want to become an Advocation partner or Alliance partner, join us. We also have so-called test labs that we work with partners. We work on these blueprints and also have our conference coming up. So just thank you all for attending and see you in the plenary.